This is American Government, Friday, August 28th, 2020. We are on our fourth lecture or class on the Declaration of Independence. Just to remind you, our procedure was to start from the outside, from historical circumstances that produced the revolution and the document, then looked at the structure of the document, its outline, its contents. Then on Monday, we looked at some aspects of the language, especially the turn to self-evident, in order to open up the deepest inside, the principles or inner truths of the Declaration. And I argued that the core truths of the Declaration are a doctrine about nature, and it's upon nature and the rational grasp of nature that the Declaration's authority rests. A doctrine about human nature, that human beings are equal and they have rights, and a core teaching about government, that government exists to secure rights, that it derives its power from consent, and that the people have the right to alter and abolish it. Just to finish the discussion of the structure, then the rest of the Declaration, Part 3, all the charges against the king, are proof that the government under the king is failing to secure the rights of Americans, and therefore they have the right to abolish or secede from it. And remember, just to pull the parts of the Declaration together, the fourth part, where the blame for the misgovernment, although the thrust of it is in the long section on the king, and that he has waged war and is a tyrant, the blame also goes to Parliament, and obviously because Parliament, if you look at the history, was the acts that Parliament passed, like the Stamp Act, etc., that actually started the revolution, taxation without representation. But within the Declaration, the blame is that the representative institutions of the British people should have resisted the king's tyrannization, and the British people themselves should have come to our defense. Our British brethren, consanguinity, common blood. So, in some ways, that fourth part's necessary to complete the full act of dissolution, which is the first act in the first paragraph, to dissolve the political bands. The British Crown, the British Parliament, the British people have treated us so badly that our rights as human beings were damaged, and we have the right to our own independence and government. And in the last part of the Declaration, the concluding paragraph, is literally an invocation of the original resolution by Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, that independence, sovereignty, war and peace, treaties, and our sacred honor and our fortunes. Okay, good. So then what we're doing now is moving back away from the Declaration and to see the place of the Declaration and the controversies about the Declaration in American life. And I've chosen 4 commentaries that raise the core questions about the meaning of the Declaration and its relationship to ongoing American life. And as we'll see when we get to the last commentator, the science fiction writer Kurt Vonnegut, who in a short story, Harrison Bergeron, raises profound questions about the simple inner consistency of the 2 primary statements about human beings in the Declaration, liberty and equality. So let's look at these 4 authors and see how they turn to the Declaration to find instruction for or guidance and standards for American life. So the first one is from the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Strictly speaking, not the debates themselves, but as I point out in my notes, the historical background. This was a speech that Lincoln gave on June 27th, 1857, not long after the Dred Scott decision had passed. Now, you could say that in the early 1850s, the country was moving towards civil war. This is the historical background. And everyone knew that if the one part of the country were to secede, that a terrible and bloody struggle, and any responsible statesman would try to avoid that. As you're going to see, I'm not going to try to justify Stephen Douglas's clearly, I think, mistaken interpretation, but rather why an intelligent and caring statesman could give such a profoundly misguided interpretation. I'm taking a partisan stand, I guess, between these 2 individuals. Because remember, it's not just, and of course, the historical background of their debates was in 1857 and then in 1858, Stephen Douglas was a senator, was running as senator, and Lincoln challenged him. Lincoln had been a single-term congressman, one term, but then in the 1840s, but had not held elective office. And when the old Whig Party fell apart, we're going to turn about this later when we turn to the history of our party system. Then the Republican Party formed, and the primary issue dividing the generation in the 1850s was, of course, slavery. The issue that, in some ways, the founders hoped would resolve itself peacefully, obviously was coming to a full head, and as history would prove, could not resolve itself peacefully. Where did the drift towards civil war begin? Probably in 1850 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which gave, when we turn to our review of the Constitution in a few weeks, you'll see that the Constitution in Article 4 has what's called the Fugitive Slave Clause. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was an attempt to give teeth to that. Then that was followed by, in 1853, one of the most remarkable publication events in American history, by the wife of a Congregational minister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a bestseller, one of the bestsellers in American life, and obviously began to generate not only anti-slavery sentiment, but also anxiety on the part and resentment on the part of Southerners because of what they considered Northern interference. We probably won't discuss in this class the great question of what the Civil War was fought for. The two typical answers are states' rights and slavery. Those two issues became intermingled, of course, and the evidence that it wasn't just state sovereignty, but also slavery. The evidence is the language of the resolutions of secession that followed the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. South Carolina was, of course, the first state to secede. And when you look at South Carolina's resolution of secession passed, I think, on December 21st, 1860, you'll see that it refers primarily to the necessity of seceding because of Northern interference with slavery. But at any rate, after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably the crystallizing event was Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, and his former master had sold him, Dr. Everson had sold him to Sanford. Sanford took Dred Scott to Illinois for a while. Missouri was a slave state, and Illinois was a free state. But then Dr. Sanford took Dred Scott to the Minnesota Territory, which was part of the old Northwest Territory under the old Articles. And in 1787, the Congress, one of the last major legislative acts of the Congress under the Articles, was to pass the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade slavery. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820 also made slavery illegal above the northern border of Missouri for the territories coming into the Union. So then Dr. Sanford, or Mr. Sanford, brought Dred Scott back to Missouri, and Dred Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had become a free man in Illinois and certainly in the Minnesota Territory, and therefore had become a citizen of the United States, and was therefore entitled to sue Sanford in court. Chief Justice Taney, writing for the majority, not only held that Dred Scott did not become a citizen, he went much further. He declared the Missouri Compromise of 1820 illegal or unconstitutional, and because it deprived slave owners of property in violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. But he actually went much further and said that not only did Dred Scott not become a citizen of the United States, no black person, no African American could ever be a citizen of the United States. He agreed that a state like New York or Illinois could make an African American a citizen, but that person could never be. In other words, you could be a citizen of a state, but not of the America. And as you'll see, Stephen Douglas imitates or essentially adopts the same point of view, that the framers did not consider black people full human beings, and that the Declaration of Independence was not meant to include them. You'll see, obviously, Lincoln disagrees with those propositions, as we'll see. Now, the everyone knew in 1858 that Douglas and Lincoln, who were running for senator, would in 2 years be running for president. And indeed, the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the issues of Dred Scott were rehearsed in that presidential election. When Lincoln was elected president, almost immediately, the 11 states of the Confederacy seceded. And as you'll find out when we talk about the Constitution later, at that time, our elections, which have always been held in November, but the taking of office for the president and the Congress didn't take place in March, because when the first Congress met and the first president was elected in 1789, they met on March 4th for the first time, and that's why the beginning of office. It was the 20th Amendment, as you'll see, that moved the beginning of office from March to January. As a result, there were 6 months almost between the time that our federal officials were elected and the time they took office. In that 6-month time, the Union fell apart. So, on one level, that was the event that all statesmen and political leaders in the United States in the late 1850s were trying to avoid. I say this so that in some ways you can see why someone like Stephen Douglas, who could read the Declaration as we have, came to the conclusion that that indeed his two primary claims: one, that when the Declaration says all men are created equal, it does not mean all men, but rather all white men. And as Lincoln pushes that argument, not only does it not mean all white men, but only British people were equal to British people. That's how Stephen Douglas interprets the meaning. So all men are created equal, according to Stephen Douglas, means white British citizens or subjects are equal to white British subjects. The other claim that he's making is that the Declaration is merely an historical document. That is to say, the Declaration its only purpose was to justify the historical revolution, and like you could imagine, like the military uniforms of the day, or the food of the day, or the kinds of way that people lived in houses. You might go to a museum of the Revolution and see those kinds of things, and there you would see a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Douglas is arguing, in other words, that the Declaration only had historical significance for that first generation. Therefore, it has no meaning or relationship or moral consequences or even political guidance for subsequent generations of Americans. You'll see that Lincoln completely disagrees with those two things, and his interpretation is not hard to follow. Why would Douglas have argued such a thing? Again, let's go back to Lincoln. Lincoln argues in response to Douglas, no, when the Declaration says all men are created equal, it means all human beings are equal. Even though it didn't mean that all human beings were made immediately equal socially, politically, economically, etc. Nevertheless, the Declaration is addressed to all humanity, not only then, and this is the second part of Lincoln's interpretation, that the Declaration it means all human beings, and second, that it is of not only relevance, it is the central statement of American principles then and now. It's the standard for American life toward which subsequent generations approximate and see and measure their government by. Now, you'll see that President Obama, in his second inaugural, actually takes exactly the same approach as Lincoln. Now, again, so you have to then see the context. Why would somebody disagree with that? After all, you could say what supports Lincoln's position is the simple language of the Declaration. Doesn't it mean what it says? Why would Taney and Douglas, Chief Justice Taney and Dred Scott and Douglas in these debates, why would they argue such an obvious contradiction? And even Lincoln, derisively asked at the end, you guys are preparing to celebrate the 4th of July. You're going to read the Declaration. Why? If Douglas is right, it's just a historical artifact. So you could say this. Lincoln clearly thought, as you'll see, because I'm going to quote from an earlier part of the speech, which I have to tell you the Nichols excised, I think because they thought it was politically incorrect. And you'll see when I'm going to read the language, and it does seem a little politically incorrect. But the reason I'm going to read it is it gives perfect expression to Lincoln's understanding of the Declaration and the fact that the Declaration means that slavery is morally wrong. Now, if you tell half the nation that their practice, and you understand slavery wasn't just an issue of, say, custom or dress, it raised fundamental questions of national identity and human identity. It was necessarily a radical meaning, by the way, that radical something that's radical raises the root questions. Radix is the Latin word for root, and radical means going to the root. This was no trivial question. It raised You couldn't avoid the Declaration and interpretation, the interpretation of the Declaration. So, in a way, you have to see what Lincoln was saying is that slavery is morally wrong. Half of the country's core institution is inconsistent with the nation's founding principles. You could say that that would probably alienate half the country and drive it further to secession. That was Douglas's argument, and in that light, you can see why Douglas tried to remove the Declaration. Lincoln's trying to connect the Declaration to the issue of slavery and subsequent American life. Douglas wants to separate it because he doesn't want to drive Southerners. He doesn't want to tell Southerners as Americans that you are inconsistent with American principles. And of course, you could say historically that was the case. When Lincoln was elected president, he and the Republican Party never argued. When we come to the Constitution, you'll see why that national government had the power to remove slavery in the existing slave states. He did claim that the national government had the power to restrict slavery to those existing states. Nevertheless, the Southerners immediately saw Lincoln as a threat, and of course that led to the dissolution of the Union, his election as president. So you could say on one level, even though nobody wanted a secession in a civil war, the bloodiest war in our history, nevertheless you can see why Douglas might argue. And in some ways, both Taney and he were also saying, if you say that they meant all men were created equal and they had slaves, you're accusing them of being hypocrites, which is unpatriotic. And you'll see Lincoln argued here and in other places, it's not that they were hypocrites. Clearly, they knew that the practice of slavery, by and large, even the Southern plantation owners like Madison and Jefferson knew that slavery violated the principles they were adopting. Lincoln's take was they did not expect the Declaration's principles to be immediately embodied in every respect. Now, you can call that hypocrisy. You can call it inconsistency, but you can see what Douglas is trying to do. He's trying to hold the Union together and prevent the framers from being called hypocrites. We'll come back to that great question and that terrifying question about not only political morality, but the ability of our lives to simply be moral, even on the individual level. Not everyone is consistent with the things we believe in. That's true of nations and individuals, too. But at any rate, I've already laid out the core positions and why. So here, in this great crisis of the nation in the 1850s and 60s, it turns on how you interpret the Declaration of Independence. Now, so in that sense, just to say, Lincoln not only agreed that the Declaration was aimed at all human beings at that time, regardless of race, creed, color, as we saw in the language of self-evident, that it was relevant to and understandable by all human beings, no matter what their individual backgrounds. But it also applied to all subsequent generations of Americans, as we'll see President Obama argue. One final note. This is the part of this speech in the Nichols reader that the Nichols cut out. You'll see why. It's difficult language, and it kind of suggests Lincoln was not as high-minded as we might think. The reason I want to read it is remember, our main purpose is to understand what the principles of the Declaration are. Lincoln, I thought, and this is why I think he was the greatest American statesman, perhaps the greatest statesman in human history. Not only was he a remarkable human and could find a human connection with all human beings, he was a brilliant man, raised in abject poverty, taught to read by the fire. That's not a myth. And his favorite books when he was growing up, the Bible and Shakespeare. And you can see Shakespearean and biblical rhetoric resonates through his speech. He also had this remarkable gift of taking the most complex ideas, political, philosophic, and putting them in absolutely concrete language, which is that's why I want to read this um, excerpt. Now, be prepared for a somewhat um, uh, distasteful, we would say it, give towards the prejudices of his time. This speech was given to people in Illinois. Even though the people in Illinois were anti-slavery, that doesn't mean they were free of prejudice or bigotry. So, on one level, you have to put that in context. But when we get to the end of this paragraph, you'll see that Lincoln, I think, grasped truly the principles of the Declaration, able to state its core human teaching in absolutely concrete and understandable terms. So here is the selection. There is a natural disgust in the mind of nearly all white people to the idea of an indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and black races. And Judge Douglas evidently is basing his chief hope upon the chances of being able to appropriate the benefit of this disgust to himself. If he can, by much drumming and repeating, fasten the odium of that idea upon his adversaries, he thinks he can struggle through the storm. He therefore clings to this hope as a drowning man to the last plank. You can tell that in electoral contests, contestants then as now were not particularly nice to each other. But at least they took their argument seriously, as you'll see. He makes an occasion for lugging it from the opposition to the Dred Scott decision. He finds the Republicans insisting that the Declaration of Independence includes all men, black as well as white. And of course, Lincoln argues that it does. You're going to see what Douglas and the Democrats are accusing Lincoln and the Republicans are. If you argue the Declaration includes all human beings, it's because you want a complete mixture of the races, including marriage, etc., etc. And you're going to see Lincoln refutes that, but still clings to the idea at the end that the Declaration includes everyone. He finds the Republicans insisting that the Declaration includes all men, black as well as white. And forthwith, he boldly denies that it includes Negroes at all. The end, obviously, this is the older way that people referred to that time, and proceeds to argue gravely that all who contend it does do so only because they want to vote and eat and sleep and marry with Negroes. He will have it that they cannot be consistent else. Now, I protest against that counterfeit logic, which concludes that. Now, listen to the example that Lincoln chooses to embody the principles of the Declaration. He refers to, as you'll see, a black woman who clearly at that time would have been, in terms of social, political, economic equality, educational equality, would not have been his equal. But listen to what he says, which contends that because I do not want a black woman as a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for either. I can just leave her alone. In some respects, she is certainly not my equal, but in her natural right to eat the bread that she earns with her own hands, without asking leave of anyone else, she is my equal and the equal of all others. He gets that self-evident truth that that black woman over there is the equal of every human being on earth in their needs, their powers, and their essential freedom. And to enslave another human being, to try to own another human being as a piece of property, is taking their human nature away from them. So it violates the essential principle of the Declaration. So, as you'll see, in making the argument that the Declaration is an eternal statement of principle, he was linking it to the issues of the day, and in the mind of his opponents and in the mind of the Southerners, he was actually radicalizing and calling them un-American. Now, I think Lincoln has the right interpretation. The Declaration wasn't just a historical document, and its language means what it says. And it has, again, I think that remarkable statement. When you sweat your body, as Locke suggests in the Second Treatise of Government in 1688, you're mixing your body in with your labor. It's your sweat that generates your property. When somebody owns you, they're taking your sweat away from you. They are stealing your human nature and therefore violating the principles of the Declaration. Okay. The second commentary on the Declaration is from a political scientist, a professor of mine at Northern Illinois University, in 1974 when I was a freshman in 1970, not 1870. You little young whippersnappers. Um, so and Diamond was a great professor and a remarkably deep individual. Voted several times one of the 10 best professors in the country. He was a remarkable teacher and very funny. You're going to meet him later on in this course because he defended the Electoral College. In fact, up to the moment of his death. The article that we're going to read, Defending the Electoral College, he actually delivered an argument in 1977 before the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. And just as he finished, he died of a massive heart attack defending the Electoral College. So we'll come back to Diamond. Here, it was in 1976. It was the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. So he gave this essay, this lecture, trying to explain what the Declaration means. The title of this essay is The Revolution of Sober Expectations. What he does is he argues 3 revolutions have created the modern world as we know it. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and the Russian Revolution in 1917. And his argument is the American Revolution was different from the Russian and French revolutions in that those 2 other great revolutions ended in chaotic bloodbaths and mass murder. It's estimated that the guillotine during the terror in the 1790s, that possibly as much as at times 4,000 people were being beheaded by the guillotine. That one contemporary observer said the streets literally ran with blood. And Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian dissident who wrote this great take on Soviet tyranny while he was in the Soviet Gulag prison slave system, the Gulag archipelago, and came to this country in 1977, estimated that the Soviet regime killed between 1917 and 1977 perhaps 100 million people. That's a large number, and most observers say it's probably between 50 to 60. Either way, it's clear that the French and Soviet revolutions ended in mass murder in a way that the American didn't. Diamond sees, therefore, in the American Revolution a kind of sobriety. Now, many observers would say, of course, it's because those revolutions in France and in Russia were actually social revolutions where you had massively impoverished peasants or serfs revolting against an aristocracy that had exploited them. The French masses were starving, as were the Russian peasants, and that therefore that was less radical because of the social conditions, and that the American Revolution wasn't a radical social revolution of one class against another, but rather British citizens against their own British government, more like a rebellion than a revolution. I think that's an understatement, although there's probably some truth to that. Diamond's argument, as you'll see, is that the American Revolution was a sober revolution because it had as its ends a more attainable and reasonable end. That instead of trying to make everyone equal brothers, like in the French Revolution, or to equalize all social conditions and make everyone equal and comrades, that the more utopian you put your revolutionary ends, the more your revolution will have to turn to mass murder, because human beings are obviously not perfect. If you try to hold them to a standard of social and political perfection, you're going to have to actually kill a lot of them because they're just going to not meet that percent. Diamond argues the reason, in fact, here's his specific conclusion. The completion of the American Revolution and the principles of the Declaration, when you grasp what they were, was the Constitution of the United States. So his argument is the Constitution of the United States flows from the principles of the Declaration. Which principles and how does that work? What Diamond concentrates on is what the Declaration means when it says legitimate government comes from the consent of the governed. If you remember, that's the 4th principle in that second paragraph. Equality, rights, securing of rights, legitimate power from consent, alter and abolish. So what Diamond is arguing is that legitimate government means the preservation of rights and freedom. In essence, if you say the aim of government and the revolution is to keep you free so you can live your own life, that's a much more moderate principle and doesn't require the total transformation of society and mass murder as its instrument. So let's pick his argument apart. He starts out, interestingly enough, trying to undermine a contemporary, what he considers misunderstanding, that the Declaration requires the form of government to be democratic. And many people believe that. So it's interesting. The first part of his essay is to go against or prove that that opinion is wrong. His argument is that when the Declaration says government has to be grounded in consent, not that the form of government, that you have to choose a form of government that operates, as ours does, by the way, with elections, the consent of the governed, but only in the formation. So his argument is, it's what the Declaration means is, and its purpose is to state, to use his language, the beginnings or the ends of government. I know beginning and end sounds like a contradiction. Here we don't mean end like the end of the story, but rather what are your ends or purposes here? Government has to begin in consent and have as its purpose the preservation of individual and civil liberty. Now, how does that lead to the Constitution? Diamond argues that the Declaration is actually neutral to the form of government. He argues that the Declaration's principle of consent is consistent with the people choosing a monarchy if they wanted, or a aristocracy if they wanted, or a democratic republic as they chose under the Constitution. The Constitution, the Declaration, he says, doesn't say that everything in the government has to be democratic or work by the will of the people directly. It's true we have elections in two of the branches of the government. I should say the House, the Senate, and the President are at least grounded directly or indirectly in popular election. But the Supreme Court, by the way, one of the critical institutions of government, isn't even elected, and they serve for life, which many people would say that's not democratic. And Diamond would say it doesn't have to be. The Declaration simply says governments have to preserve rights and secure rights and liberty, and they have to originate in consent. So the people could technically consent to any form of government they wanted. Now, they did, in fact, consent to the Constitution, and Diamond argues that the Constitution is, in fact, the democratic Republican fulfillment of it. We'll explore that more next week when we talk about the construction of the Constitution and examine the Constitution. So, his final thought then, if your revolutionary principle is perfect equality or perfect comradeship or perfect brotherhood, that's a radical principle that requires the radical reform of all human life. And again, his argument is that a principle so radical will probably lead to mass murder or persecution. On the other hand, if all you expect of government is to keep people free, if you tell to a population the purpose of government is to keep you free and safe, that's a moderate aim and therefore will lead to a moderate constitution. And of course, that's what he argues the Constitution is, and we'll see if he's right about that when we turn to the Constitution. The third observer of the Declaration is, of course, President Obama. And as I suggested, President Obama takes Lincoln's suggestion that the Declaration is the eternal standard. So let me use a mathematical analogy that will probably confuse you all, but you've all had high school algebra. You know what a parabola is, and you know what a hyperbola is, and you know, et cetera, and so on, et cetera. Well, strictly speaking, the definition of a hyperbola is a curve that approaches a limit, an asymptote, but never reaches it. And so in some ways, that's kind of what Lincoln and Obama say the Declaration is. It's the standard that American life, generation by generation, moves towards and becomes closer to it. So in some ways, even if the embodiment of American principles was flawed, and it was in the beginning, and with respect to race, with respect to women, and you'll see the way that President Obama states it, we try every generation in American life to make the principles of the Declaration have closer in meaning and more obvious. For President Obama, he in fact argues it's easy to remember the way, because he refers to the three S's of what he calls the great social revolution that occurred 100 years ago with women's suffrage. Selma, so Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls Declaration, Selma, during the great civil rights struggle for racial equality. So we have gender equality, racial equality, and Stonewall. In the late 60s, when the Manhattan police raided a gay bar on Stonewall Street, and the gays in New York then started a kind of a rebellion, and that kind of led to the revolution in gay rights. So President Obama sees Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall as successive applications of the principle of liberty and equality, rights in the Declaration, to ever expanding populations. Now, I have to say, I agree with that, and I think that our country is in some ways closer to the principles of the Declaration with respect to gender, race, sexual equality, even sexual identity equality. And you could see that when he was writing, transgenderism wasn't even on the horizon. But and I said this early at the beginning of class, in a way, I think President Obama would agree with me, although he makes more money or made more money than I did. Um, um, that all political issues in the United States eventually do get framed in terms of rights and the Declaration. Whether it's abortion, we talked about that, how both sides in the abortion debate referred to the Declaration and the concept of rights. Whether it's healthcare, whether it's Social Security or marriage equality or whatever. Every generation of Americans is trying to find new ways of applying the Declaration of Independence. Therefore, as I've suggested, and I agree with Lincoln, Obama, and everyone else in this respect, the Declaration is, in fact, the eternal standard of American life. It's at the heart of the American regime. Often it is imperfect in its enforcement and embodiment, as Lincoln said, but that's where we as a nation are. It's the limit, the asymptote towards which the curve of American politics approximates. Our last witness, our last commentator, is Kurt Vonnegut. It's a science fiction story. It was turned into a very bad television movie with Sean Astin, the guy that played Sam in The Lord of the Rings, playing Harrison Bergeron. So, what's the premise? As the story opens up, it's the year 2081, and the 211th, 12th, and 13th Amendments to the Constitution. You're going to discover there are only 27 at this point. Have been passed, making everybody equal. It's created a unique office, the U.S. Handicapper General. Now, this story was written in a time when even the word handicapped was today it's a little politically correct. We say disabled or whatever. But the Diana Moon Glampers, what a great name, is the handicapper general, and the Bergerons, uh, George Bergeron and his wife are sitting watching television, and it and the way that those amendments work is to make everybody equal. How so? Well, we saw that the Declaration admits that there may be inequalities of strength and beauty and intelligence. So, if you're going to make everyone equal, what the handicapper general has to do is when somebody has an excessively high talent or ability, you've got to handicap them. So, all the smart people have implants in their ears that constantly emit big noises. Today, we call them cell phones. Uh, um, uh, and if you're strong, like Harrison is, he's a great athletic individual, then you have to wear weighted bags. Uh, if you're ugly, and if you're beautiful, you have to wear an ugly mask so that nobody's more beautiful. So everyone is absolutely equal. So on one level, you could say it's ironic. It has an unintended consequences. In trying to make everyone equal by imposing the appropriate handicap given their natural excellence, they admit who's excellence. Moreover, they give all the available positions to individuals who have limitations. Uh, when the announcer comes on to announce that Harrison has escaped from prison, it turns out that he has a speech defect, and one of the ballerinas has to come over and read the announcement. Now, it's wickedly funny, and you could even say it's offensive. But as you're going to see, it raises a profound question. We Americans, who are an optimistic people, we think everything could be done. There's no limitations. Any social arrangement is possible. Any effort can be achieved, and that's good to be optimistic. I think that's one of our great defining qualities. Having said that, we have a tendency to think that these two concepts from the Declaration, liberty and equality, that all human beings are equal and they are free, that they're simply harmonious with each other. In fact, identical. And you can even state them so that they're kind of identical. We are equal in our freedom, and we are free because we are equal. And there's some truth to that. The reason we're free of the king is because he's not a superior to us. So in some ways, on one level, you could say liberty and equality converge. But what Vonnegut is trying to do in his science fiction story is to create a situation where we can see that the more equal you make people, the less free they are. That there in fact might be other values in life that equality can eat up and dissolve, like beauty, like excellence. Because on the one hand, if you were looking at it, would be like today there are no winners and losers in athletic contests. Everybody gets an award so that nobody feels bad. Everyone has to be treated equally. More seriously, at our college campuses, you could say there's a contest between those who advocate freedom of speech in an unrestricted way and those who argue that certain speech is insensitive and actually makes or excludes other people from the community. And therefore, you could say what it reveals is a tension between liberty and equality. I'm not taking sides on that question, but what I want you to see is what Vonnegut sees, which is the tension. So I want to end this lecture with another author, Alexis de Tocqueville. We'll talk more about him later in the course. And I teach an entire course, American Political Thought, almost devoted exclusively to that great book. But on this tension between liberty and equality, listen what de Tocqueville has to say, sort of anticipating Vonnegut's insight. Um, this is from Democracy in America, which he wrote in 1831. He was a French aristocrat, young, born in 1805, came to this country in 1831 because he wanted to see a place where he thought democracy had worked. Remember, he was French. And in Europe, after the French Revolution, which ended in murder and chaos and eventually imperial tyranny under Napoleon, people didn't have such a great opinion of democracy. But de Tocqueville thought that in America, democracy had more or less actually established itself and worked pretty well. So he came to this country in 1831 to study it. He traveled around everywhere for 9 months, read everything, talked to everyone, and then went back and wrote this massive book. So he too comments on the tension between liberty and equality and how it may work out in democratic political life. This is from volume 2, part 2, chapter 1. Quote, I think that democratic communities have a natural taste for freedom. Left to themselves, they will seek it, cherish it, and view any privation of it with regret. But for equality, their passion is ardent, insatiable, incessant, invincible. They call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality and slavery. They will endure poverty, servitude, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. This is true at all times, and especially true in our own. All men and all powers seeking to cope with this irresistible passion for equality will be overturned and destroyed by it. In our age, freedom cannot be established without it, and despotism itself cannot reign without its support. When I was an undergraduate and read de Tocqueville for the first time in 1973, you have to remember the Cold War was still on. And I have to say, it was the conclusion of his volume 1 where he kind of looked into the future and predicted. Listen to what he predicted. He predicted that the globe, would eventually become divided between two superpowers, Russia and America. Now, that was an amazing prediction in 1831. And this is what he said. America liberates the freedom of the individual and leaves the common sense of the individual to decide society. The Russian concentrates all the strength of society as it was in one man. One has freedom as its means of action, the other servitude. Each seems designed by some secret plan of providence to hold within its hands the fate of half the earth. Now, in 1973, that seemed like an amazing prophecy. In 2020 and 21, you'd say Russia seems to have fallen off the world stage, maybe. But isn't it true that China, in some ways, and the People's Republic of China, has that same view of enforced equality that we were associated with Soviet communism? My point here is de Tocqueville is right. The best of all possible worlds is to have a certain embrace of equality with freedom. But it may be that under certain conditions, those two values do collide with each other. And as you're going to see in our own life today, and perhaps in the future, it's our task to try to reconcile those two principles so that you don't have freedom leading to unacceptable inequality and you don't have equality eating up and destroying freedom. On Monday, we'll turn to the events of the founding period that led to the Constitution. We'll first examine the Articles of Confederation and the defects of the Articles, and on Wednesday, we'll turn to the Constitutional Convention and see how the Constitution was constructed. And on Friday, we'll turn to the two great essays, The Theory of the Constitution, Federalist 10 and Federalist 51.